Thanks for clicking. The Bank of Canada could be going lighter on interest rate cuts on the election of Prime Minister Mark Carney. This according to a new report coming from the Financial Post.
I got nothing.
Yeah, in that argument that because the government is about to spend so much money that the Bank of Canada won't have to do the heavy lifting to stimulate economic growth, is one being backed up by Oxford Economics, which says that the government is about to turn on the taps. And while that is probably true, that the government is about to spend an awful lot of money, as we'll see today, history tells us that that doesn't exactly preclude the Bank of Canada cutting rates and cutting rates substantially. In fact, central bank rate cuts and government deficits almost always work in tandem.
I'll try to help you, all right?
God bless you, Paulie. I appreciate it. God bless you.
So what I want to do today is go over those arguments saying the Bank of Canada won't be able to cut because of the election of Mark Carney, take a look at the underlying mechanics, as well as the history of rate cuts and deficit spending, and then discuss some implications. As we'll see today, the future isn't quite as simple as current hyperboles pretend, but we will obviously continue to track Canada's economic development on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into this argument. On to Prime Minister Mark Carney, who won a minority government on Tuesday night. And it's that minority government, says Stephen Brown of Capital Economics, that could lead to even greater increases in spending than the $130 billion already promised. Brown says that because Carney is going to need the support of the other political parties in order to stay in power, he's going to have to pay for it, noting that he's going to have to grant concessions to the parties in exchange for supporting the government, which means fiscal policy could end up even looser than the Liberals have signaled. Which, yeah, that wouldn't be surprising whatsoever, as we're all well aware the NDP was able to extract all sorts of concessions in exchange for supporting former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And if we do see this type of arrangement again, says David Rosenberg, then that's going to be less pressure for the Bank of Canada to cut rates than there would have been if the Conservatives had won. So the idea is that because the Liberals, especially now, have to bribe the other parties in order to stay in power, that they'll be spending a lot more than they had initially intended, that the Bank of Canada won't have to step in as hard to prop up the economy. A point that was reiterated by Tony Stillo of Oxford Economics.
They're fighting a really difficult battle on two fronts, both the higher inflation from the tariffs and the downturn in the economy, and they were going to be very pragmatic and kind of hold rates where they are today in a kind of neutral territory. And this actually lends more credence to that because the federal government, with the fiscal policy measures they're talking about, is going to do more of the heavy lifting.
So yeah, because the government's going to be spending so much money into the economy, deficit spending at that, the central bank won't have to print as much to help support it.
Okay.
And though, as we'll see in a few minutes, that should be how it works, history doesn't exactly give credence to that narrative. Let's take a look at the government's proposed deficits, projected to be 1.96% of GDP in 25 to 26. Though, as a brief aside, it is worth noting that some economists have called these numbers to be far too optimistic. Derek Holt of Scotiabank, who has had some of the more realistic predictions in the past, recently noted that these are all made-up numbers, to be frank. Holt wrote in another note that these deficit projections could be understated, as they rely on assumptions from March 5th, which, as we all know, was well before Liberation Day. So, Carney's spending plans were expected to lead to a 2% of GDP deficit going forward, and that was before they had to bribe the support of the other parties, and that was using old data.
How much milk do you want?
We're all fine.
But let's stick with the 2% of GDP spending and see if that was enough to stave off rate cuts in the past 4 decades worth of available data. And if we look at history going back all the way to 1980, we can see that any and all deficit spending was met with simultaneous or near simultaneous rate cuts from the Bank of Canada. If we look back at 2020, obviously we got rate cuts. In 2016, even a tiny bit of deficit spending got us rate cuts. In 2009, we had the global financial crisis met along with rate cuts, a bit of fiscal stimulus post 9/11, and then a lot of rate cuts pre-1995, despite massive amounts of fiscal spending. So, judging by every single instance over the past 40 years, just because the government engages in deficit spending doesn't mean the central bank holds pat.
This doesn't make any sense.
So what I think we need to do is narrow the focus a little bit. Why exactly is the government spending? If the government is spending, if the government is borrowing money to provide fiscal support to a tanking economy due to the fallout from the Trump tariffs, and that fallout has been so bad that unemployment has skyrocketed, and the important part, inflation has gone down as a result, then, as we've seen before, the central bank could very well work in tandem with the fiscal authorities, providing support to help the fiscal path along. On the other hand, if the threat from the South subsides, which isn't out of the realm of possibility, and the government continues to spend like the threat is still there, which also isn't out of the realm of possibility, well then that's a different story, and it's at that point that Canadians could and should expect Governor Macklem to discipline the fiscal authorities.
Just f***ing stop.
But Prime Minister Carney knows this very well. As he noted back in 2022 when he was criticizing Liz Truss, fiscal and monetary authorities should not be working at cross purposes. Or, to quote Carney directly, if one foot is on the brake and that's monetary policy, then the other should not be stomping on the gas. Now, is Prime Minister Carney going to remember what Governor Carney said and work with the Bank of Canada? Or is he going to work at cross purposes? I don't know. They're both central bank governors. They should both know not to suck and blow at the same time. And Governor Macklem knows that Prime Minister Carney knows that.
And I know, you know.
So, what does all this mean? It means that we're getting ahead of ourselves and trying to predict interest rates at this uncertain early date. It means that, just as it did on Monday, Canada's economy rests on the fate of one man, and it's not the Prime Minister of Canada. If these tariffs continue to materialize and Canada gets economically swamped, as history shows, then yeah, the central bank will probably step in to support the fiscal authorities, will probably continue to cut rates. Deficit spending probably isn't going to stop them, with the small caveat that inflation just might. If the tariffs don't continue, if we continue to see reprieve after reprieve, and Carney still continues with those spending plans, which are hard to pull back for any politician, then we could, hopefully, expect the Bank of Canada governor to do his job and discipline the fiscal authorities. He's done it before. In fact, he got quite vocal about the fiscal authorities during 2024. But look, all of this could be moot. The 13-dimensional grand chess master himself has already worked 200 trade deals, and we're seeing the results of that grand mastery at work in real time. As such, the most severe of these tariff threats could subside at some point in the near future, paving the way for the Grand Master to move on to another victory in the upcoming tax plan. Again, leaving much of this to be moot points. Regardless though, if the economy experiences such a downturn that inflation is kept in check, I wouldn't expect deficit spending to keep Governor Macklem on the sidelines from intervening into the market, from providing the fiscal authorities with some additional policy support. Canada, for better or for worse, depends an awful lot on its real estate market, and I wouldn't expect Bank of Canada Governor Macklem to resist using that lever. Now, I'm not saying at all that the Bank of Canada should provide that policy support, that the printer should come to the rescue. I'm just saying that history supports it. That when the government deficit spends, the Bank of Canada has almost every single time come to the rescue to provide additional support, the results of which are on clear display for everyone. With that said, as I've tried to stress, though a discussion of the future of interest rate cuts is premature at this point, we will obviously continue to track these developments on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.